Over these last few weeks, I've been telling you that the church is in some sort of crisis, that the world has changed, that now no longer can we predict what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone 5 years in the future. Where we used to make plans that we could predict would occur in a predictable way over a period of time, we can no longer do that. We call this discontinuous change. Things just happen. Pandemics happen. Changes happen. Things just creep up on us from seemingly nowhere, and we cannot predict the future. Another change which has occurred, particularly in the Christian community, is that what we call Christendom has come to an end because the world changed. No longer is the church the centre of society, as it was when Christendom ruled. We are no longer that core group within the way in which culture works. We are now a splinter group. And in some ways, a despised splinter group. Not exactly hated, but certainly not trusted in the way we once were. Christendom was that system where the church could predict that it had some power and control over the belief systems and the way in which people would behave within society. We were those who set the moral compass, and we no longer hold that place. So the question for us is, what do we do now? And that's why I have developed this readiness for mission approach, in the sense that I want to suggest and encourage you to see that there are ways of approaching a new era. It means going back to the basics. It means going back to what matters to us most deeply. And that's not control of society. That's not setting the moral compass. That's within our belief frameworks and what we believe. Have you ever made a New Year's resolution? And have you ever been able to make that New Year's resolution really happen? Or thank you. Once in a while it works, doesn't it? Because we turn that good intention, which is expressed in the resolution, we turn it into a deliberate action. And that's pretty much what I want to say this morning. What do they say about good intentions? The road to hell is paved with them. Because they never turn into deliberate action. I've talked to you about a whole series of things that could be very good intentions. But really what I want to say in this last little bit is that I'd hope that some of these things might turn into deliberate action. You need to think about them and consider them, and at least decide upon something that turns into deliberate action. If it's not these things, what will it be? Because all of us need to set the scene of, putting things in place. And what then is the basis of that deliberate action? What are your basic resources? When crisis comes into our lives, what we tend to do is go back to what our basic resources are. And normally that has something to do with survival. And I think there are two ways in which human beings approach survival. We approach survival of the body, that is our physical life. We either approach and that means that we head towards financial resources, physical resources, diets, things that keep the body from deteriorating. Healthy practices, all sorts of things that keep us alive. In the church, we talk about practices that might keep the system running. How do we get more members? How do we get more money? How do we get... That's about survival of the body. But I think there's another type of survival, the survival of the person. When we talk about survival of the person, I think what I mean by that is that we begin to look at what matters to me, what matters to the community we live with, rather than just the structures we live under. What matters is what we believe, what we value most deeply, what is the foundation of our life. Rather than simply looking after the body, we look after the soul, the spirit, the belief framework, the truth. Jesus went into the garden. In the garden, Jesus was presented with a significant choice. He had that choice between survival of the body or survival of the person or the people. When he went into the garden, he recognized what was about to happen to him. And he says really clearly, I don't want this to happen. Is there any way this cup can be taken from me? Do I have to really do this? He had a choice. If he'd taken off right there and headed off to Galilee, he could have been the best mega church preacher the world had ever seen, because he was really popular in Galilee. He could have been a good preacher for a very long time, and that might have been a good excuse to protect the body, his body, from what was coming. But what did he say? Not my will, but yours be done. What he understood was that which God wanted him to do in terms of his ministry of love for the people, which the consequences of which was what was about to happen on the cross. While he lost his body, in a sense, he died, he preserved his person. And you and I believe that his person is still present. His person is still alive. So Jesus made a choice. In the dilemma of intention and deliberate action, he chose the deliberate action of following the will of God. Paul went to Corinth. And when he was in Corinth, in chapter 2, he tells them that when he came, he chose, deliberate choice was to preach to them the simple gospel of Christ and him crucified. He wanted them to know that Jesus had died for them. He wanted them to know the grace of God. He wanted to know want them to know the depth of God's love. It was a deliberate choice. His intention and his deliberate action followed. His intention was to share the gospel. His deliberate action was to share the gospel. I might add, some people misunderstand that this was not the only message that Paul spoke. Because by the time he gets to chapter 3, he's telling them, when I came in the first place, I gave you the milk. There's also meat to be had. And I'm about to share that with you, as I need to challenge some aspects of the way in which the gospel is understood amongst you and the behaviour that you're part of, so that you need to make deliberate choices. Your intentions might have been good, but you need to make some deliberate actions about the love of God yourself. That's chapter 3. But in chapter 2, he made a deliberate choice to just share with them the gospel of Jesus and him crucified. So what were their basic resources? The love of God, the will of God, and the simple gospel of Jesus Christ. So we have a choice. Well, in the past, over my lifetime, people have presented us with a choice about protecting the body. Now, there's nothing wrong with church growth principles. I've lived with them for the last 50 years. And many of church growth principles are really positive principles if we applied them deliberately. But like a lot of things that we hear about in church, they create great intentions, beautiful mission statements, massively valuable core values, and then are forgotten in the bottom shelf. We put them away, and we don't do anything about them. There's nothing wrong with church growth principles, but they're more so about protecting, well, they're about growing the numbers in the church, which of course is a good thing, because that's actually about sharing the simple gospel of God's love. That's what's important. And there are some principles that help us to apply that well, and that's some of those church growth principles were really important in that. But where's our focus? Our intention is to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with the world. The question is, how are we going to do that deliberately? And how's that going to turn into real action through the life of the church? What is our purpose after all? Our purpose is to share the gospel with those God sends to us. That's our only purpose. We might have a Care Works program that's absolutely brilliant and large, but unless it's got some way of sharing the gospel by the loving actions of the people even, then it's pointless. Except that it's good deeds for sharing care with people. And that is the good news, after all. Sharing the love of God through action. We might have a number of clubs, activities, a Triple C program, a number of Bible study groups, the Shed, a group of blokes who sit around and drink coffee every Wednesday. And that's good. I mean, all of those things are good. And they're sharing love with one another, and that's exactly what it's for. And in a sense, that's sharing the good news of Jesus in subtle ways. And there's nothing wrong with that. But where's the deliberate action to include people within the worshipping community of the church? Because that's our primary purpose, I think. To share the gospel and include people within the worshipping community of the church so that they can feel and be included in the loving community of God, of Jesus. And that's part of what the gospel's all about. It does require change. It does require change from the way we've been doing things because the world has changed. We can't keep doing the things that we've always done because they don't work anymore. And of course, that tends to build discontent. People begin to say, I'm not happy with the way things are. A guy called Lyle Schaller, in a book called The Change Agent, talked about positive discontent. He says, and I think he's right, I wouldn't quote him, positive discontent is the engine behind all change. Or discontent, at least, is the engine behind change. It needn't be positive. It could well be negative, and the change will also be negative. Positive discontent we tend to squash, or discontent we tend to squash in the life of the church. Because, of course, that's discord and disagreement and unloving, we say. But I think I said a few weeks ago, for goodness sake, rock the boat. Because part of growing a church, part of developing the life of a church is when we recognise that we don't like the things the way they are, and somebody needs to speak up and speak for the group and say that. How do we deal with that? Discontent can be responded to in two different ways, of course, negatively and positively. Everything happens sort of negatively and positively, doesn't it? Negatively, oh, that's a bit small, isn't it? But it's small for me. Not too bad for you. When discontent occurs, people get bad-tempered and they start sniping at each other, or they begin to get rude, direct, overly direct, unkind, because I'm happy with the way things are and I wish things would change. Somebody should do something about something. And if somebody doesn't, you can see people do that. But that's not going to produce anything, because what happens when people get like that is resistance, defensiveness. There'll be a barrier that you can't get through, and all that's going to happen to you is you get very angry and you get more angry, and not much point in all that, because it doesn't get anywhere. The second thing that I think people do is they just say, can't do anything about it. Nothing's going to change. I'll just sit here. And I think this is the problem the church has more than anything else. I'll withdraw into my own corner. I've got my friends. I enjoy the community. I don't want to fuss. I'm not going to rock the boat. I'll just let things be. There are other people who are responsible. I'm not. Let them do it. I'll just sit and soak, and that'll be my contribution. I'll be there at least, and it's another form of anger, really. Did you bang your head, Lynn? I'm sorry. The third thing that they might do is, and this happens all the time too, they become disgruntled with the way things are. They don't believe they can do anything about it, so what do? They just leave. They go somewhere else. I'll go somewhere else where I like it better. And that's very common in the life of the church now. I'll just go somewhere else where I like it better. I tried really hard. I shouted at them and they didn't take any notice. I withdrew from them and they didn't notice that either. So I'm leaving. They're fine. We could deal with discontent in a more positive way. We could deliberately decide to work together. Set up a group of people who are going to talk about this thing that somebody shared that they don't find comfortable at the moment. So we talk about things. Here's a good discipline for you. Focus on me. It's the hardest thing in the world to do at the moment. But I'm challenging you to do it. Somebody says, I don't like the way things are, so we begin to talk about it together. And the question is not defensive, but the question is, how can we solve that? How can we work through that together? And maybe there's not a solution, and talking about it, we'll discover there's not really a solution, so we need to sit with it for the moment. But there may well be a solution. There may be somebody else who can contribute, so we talk together. Another positive way to do things is to actually study the situation, to look at whether there's somebody else come up with a solution to this issue that we're not happy about. Has somebody else done something useful? We could sit there and we could pray about it. We could meditate on it. We reflect on what's going on rather than getting angry, withdrawing, or resigning. We could actually set up an experiment. We could act in faith. I think this discontent that I feel is a stimulus for something else. So why don't we try this? It might not work, but it's worth a try. Not for discouragement because it didn't work, but for opportunity, that it just might. So we begin this process of exploring prayerfully, in discussion, and coming up with possible solutions, experiments that might just be great. Another way of dealing with discontent is to just stick with it. Stay, not passively, but actively ready for what might come, with the commitment that we have to each other, because we're a community. Sticking with it. And something I think is really important is recording what we decide. What I call group memory. Very often, people will come back with after a great idea is expressed, because there's nothing new in the world, they say, and the answer is to this great new idea. We tried that before, 25 years ago, and it didn't work then. Well, 25 years ago, and this is not the same group of people. Group memory would tell us what we tried and how we tried it, and what we've decided to do is something we ought to write down. So we're not coming to new subjects every other year saying, we thought, this is a great idea, but then we can bring up something and say, well, we thought about that before, yes, and this is what we wrote. How does that fit now? Because some idea that didn't work 2 years ago might just work today. So write it down and keep your group memory, your congregational memory. Intentions lead towards setting of policies. An intention is something, a good idea I'd like to do. A policy is something I plan to do. And I think the intention needs to be turned into a written policy. Write it down, a written policy. I think that's a good practice in your own life, individually. Write it down. You use a calendar for events. Why not use a document of some kind for plans, for good things you want to see done, for things you're disgruntled about, for beliefs you have that you'd like to develop. Deliberate behaviour turns into action. Once you've got the policy, you've got a basis upon which to say, this is the basis of our deliberate action. So let's try something. No policy, almost certainly no deliberate action. Not written, it probably won't happen. Agape, as you understand with me, is the centre of Christianity. God sent Jesus to express his valuing love for the world. And that's what going to the cross was all about. That's the extent to which God values us. The good and the bad, as Doug said, even the worst, deserve the grace of God, according to God. This is God's policy, God's intention. But that intention turns into action because the love of God is also about a choice of the will of deep felt commitment. God is chosen to love us, and he calls us to choose deliberately to love one another. Not a feeling in that sense, but a choice which is held with deep feeling. God's deliberate action. Well, there's God's deliberate action. The Spirit of God is given to the world, to us. That's a deliberate action of God. A policy and a deliberate action. This was a policy in the Old Testament. I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh. We can go back to Jeremiah and talk about how Jeremiah was talking about this very event, how God would inspire all of us. Here's a deliberate action, a policy and a deliberate action. A policy that leaders in the church will look for what God is doing and not try and take control. Because God has made an action and we need to see what's going on with God. And then foster that. Here's a deliberate action. We choose to support one another in ministry. We don't let people go out on their own so they become disappointed or disillusioned. We care for them in the process. We have 2 or 3 gathered for everything so that people are supported. Here's a deliberate action. We give permission. Here's a policy and a deliberate action. We decide that we're going to base our life on trust, on valuing love, trust, and a permission-giving culture, so that people feel empowered, by us at least, because they are empowered by God. And the inspirations that people get need to be supported, and that needs to be done. Here's a policy and an action. This needs to be done with intention and deliberate action. Because there is an urgency about the gospel today. As we've said, the world has changed. And people need to hear of the love of God. More so than ever, you might think. And I think more so than ever. Because rather than being part of the ritual of the life of the church in Christendom, it is now a deep need in the life of human beings who are struggling to work it out for themselves. There is an urgency for change in our lives and in the lives of people. There is an urgency for us to make plans, to make intentions that we desire to affect the world. There is an urgency within the church for deliberate action, for us to work out how we can share the gospel and invite people into the worshiping community of the church. Because that's what we're on about. We're about loving people into this community. And everything we do can contribute to that. Everything you do can contribute to that. My favourite question, I think Jesus' favourite question, I think the gospel's favourite question. How am I going to love this one? This is not a statement of intent. Well, this is a statement of intention, but it's also a question which leads to deliberate action. Because if I ask this question sincerely, something's going to happen. The Spirit of God is truly amongst the people of God. That's God's promise. The Spirit of God is amongst the people of God. That's God's promise. So He is with you, both individually and as a community. That's God's promise. You can turn that promise into passivity, or you can turn that promise into activity. You can decide what's going to happen in the future, or you can let the future take hold. And you'll just go there, which probably won't be such a pretty place. Yes, you can. Why? Because God's empowered you. Yes, you can. I believe the church has hope. I believe the Christian message is a core message for every human being. Here is a value. The love of God is a value that every human being needs to understand and be able to take within their lives. To understand the sacrificial love of Jesus. To know that God loves us to the point of changing our lives for the better. He can do that with all of us. All of us.